My name is Bill Kavanaugh. I'm the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul University, and we're proud to sponsor this week of events, World Catholicism Week, Wednesday through Sunday, all based on the theme of the church and the environment. The center that I now direct is based on it's a research center based on the Church of the Global South. And so a lot of the speakers that we're going to be hearing from over the next few days are coming from near and far, from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Tonight, though, we're going to be looking at a more homegrown manifestation of the Church's concern with the environment and looking at Catholic history. So we're very pleased to have Chris Hamlin, who Tim Darst will introduce. Before I introduce our introducer, I just want to say a word about who this lecture is named for. It's the Father Byrne Lecture, an annual lecture which is named after the first president of DePaul University. And from the very beginning, DePaul had a kind of outlook that was based on the ideas of social justice that were inculcated by St. Vincent de Paul, the founder of the Vincentian Order, who was the founder of DePaul University. So the fact that this topic is coming under the rubric of the Byrne Lecture, I think, is very appropriate. Our moderator tonight is Tim Darst, who is the director of the Kentucky Interfaith Power and Light, which is an interfaith organization in Louisville, which works on issues of the environment, creation care, climate change, and so on. So please join me in welcoming Tim Darst.
Thank you. Our speaker tonight, Christopher Hamlin, is professor of history at the University of Notre Dame. He's also the co-author of The Greening of America, Catholic Style, from 1930 to 1950. He's a historian of science, technology, and medicine. He's also the professor of the Department of History and the program in the History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Notre Dame, as well as an honorary professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. His research focuses on the application of knowledge to public needs, mainly in the areas of relating to health and the environment. In nearly 6 articles and several books, he's examined the concepts of disease and disease causation, forensic science and expert disagreement, the assessment of water and air, the regulation of environmental nuisances, social epidemiology, focusing on issues of hunger and exposure, and cultural and religious concepts of nature. He is the author of Public Health and Social Justice in the Age of Chadwick from 1800 to 1854 in Britain, a history of the early public health movement, Cholera, the Biography, which was honored as one of the British Medical Association's highly commended books in 2010, and More Than Hot, a short history of fever in 2014. Among his articles is The Greening of America, Catholic Style, 1930 to 1950, co-authored with John McGreevy. His current projects include Fever and Hunger in the Celtic Lands, and a study of the natural theological foundations of ecological ideas. These also build on other papers like Deep Disagreement in the U.S. Agriculture that he co-authored with Philip Shepard, and Religion and the New Ecology that he co-authored with David Lodge. If you're interested in any of these books, one of his books, the most recent one, is for sale outside afterwards. So, our speaker, Christopher Hamlin.
enormous honor it is for me to give this lecture. It's entirely unexpected, but when John McGreevy and I did write this article that was mentioned on the greening of America Catholic style, we sort of thought, whoops, we're going ahead here. We sort of thought this was the kind of audience that we hoped would respond to it, and this has happened. Anyway, so I'm here during World Catholicism Week, and with its concern to make a fragile earth more robust, as an educator, a role very appropriate to the memory of this university's first president, Father Peter Byrne. There's much talk these days about teaching our research, and I'm going to talk about research in my teaching, because as you've heard, mainly I'm a historian of medicine and science, but because I teach at a Catholic university, I want to do research that responds to what my students are interested in. So in 1985, when I began teaching at a Catholic university, environment was no part of that university's mission. On day one of my first offering of an environmental history course, which was then a very new field, I asked the students what environmentalism had to do with Catholicism, and they had no clue. It was a what planet did you get off of kind of reaction. They had never thought about the question, and I didn't know very much about it at that time either, but I had begun to work on projects in which religion and environment came up, and these are some of the books that Tim just mentioned. So I've done work with philosopher Philip Shepard on mediation among alternative forms of agriculture, and with the biologists David Lodge and Stephen Combs on new paradigms in scientific ecology and how they might be squared with religious ideas of nature. Today, I shall seek to establish an historical foundation from which to challenge what I take to be the unduly ambiguous status of environmental concern in contemporary Catholicism. So my departure point, despite manifold activity of many Catholic environmental organizations, such concerns are still not core Catholic issues. However important, they seem to reflect secular or even Protestant concerns. In brief, they are not beneficiaries of a sense of Catholic tradition. Now, I'd like to be proven wrong, but I think I'm right. So, Christians generally have been on the defensive since 1968, when the eminent medieval historian Lynn White Jr. Charged Judeo-Christianity with responsibility for our ecologic crisis. Though, as an afterthought, he offered St. Francis as a model for contemplative and biocentric spirituality. A promoter of all things medieval, White overlooked the disenchantment thesis of the sociologists Weber and Merton and the historians Tawney and Mumford, in which the Reformation, particularly Calvinism, had displaced rural, settled communitarianism with lonely individualism. And Tawney pictures the lonely Puritan puzzling out salvation, looking upon the world as, quote, a carcass that hath neither life nor loveliness, unquote, and seeing material wealth as an indicator of election. Extending his view, in his 1997 Protestantism, Capitalism, and Nature in America, the historian Mark Stull showed the overwhelmingly Calvinist framework of environmental debate throughout American history. Either fallen nature was the slag heap on which we sinners struggled to win riches, or it was the mirror in which we saw and found our way back to the garden we had lost. His analysis extended to environmental scientists, too, particularly ecologists. They usually came from Calvinist backgrounds. Stoll's findings had implications beyond America. Ecology was chiefly an American science, so too were exemplary environmental institutions like the National Park, where progressive era elites communed with nature. Some scholars, too, began to see environmentalism as itself a new form of religion. Only appeal to religion could explain how such moral imperiousness arose so quickly in modern society. But if it was a new form of religion, it was probably a new form of evangelical Protestantism. So, small wonder Catholics might be a bit miffed. Most American Catholics were urban and lower or middle class. They made their own colleges and universities rather than utilizing the land-grant institutions where the environmental sciences were being developed in the 1880s. Once an ecological movement existed, Catholics became part of it. Catholic social teachings translated easily into sustainability. Encyclicals, bishops' letters, communities of various sorts, lay and religious, living sustainably, issue or place-oriented groups like the ones that Tim is involved in, including student groups at Catholic universities. Post-Lynn White, numerous forms of eco-spirituality and eco-theology blossomed, some framed in Catholic philosophical, mystical, and meditative traditions. And yet, I see little sense that these have become seminal to Catholic identity. They're absent from most Catholic history, rarely penetrate routine theology teaching, or significantly inform parish life. Now, I'm sure there are exceptions, and again, I hope you will tell me about the exceptions, but I think this characterizes things generally. Now, my gripe with White and with Stoll is that they found what they were looking for because they defined what counted as an appropriate response to nature so as to exclude a long heritage of sustainable Catholic practices. The quickest way to see what I am talking about is to consider the term anthropocentric. From White on, in opposition to biocentric, it has been the dirty word. For Stoll's alienated Calvinists hoping to transcend themselves and their ugly society, nature is good, pure, and permanent, while the human world is to be rejected as artificial and unnatural. Now, from a Catholic standpoint, this is strange. Species-based selfishness is one thing. Being anti-people is quite another. Important aspects of nature lie within. Occasionally, I ponder over the historical development of the terms laws of nature, associated with Newton, and natural law, associated with Thomas. The former concerns matter and force, the latter persons, within the context of social and biogeophysical settings in which we flourish or not. The reader of Thomasist American Catholic authors of the 1930s and 1940s will be struck by how often they write of the natural, environment, stewardship, and the organic a quarter of a century before Rachel Carson. But the dominant dichotomy of the history of American environmentalism, conservation versus preservation, makes no room for them. They see no particular virtue in preservation for its own sake, but they are hardly utilitarians. For that reason, I shall, despite this being an urban university, concentrate my discussion of Catholic environmentalism on agriculture, the chief place of enacting sustainability. Now, there are sociological reasons for Stoll's findings, but there are also some theological and philosophical differences that seem to me to be profound. And I'm not going to dwell on this at this point. You may want to think about this as we go along. I do want to alert you to some of the issues about different ways of interpreting certain key texts that I think characterize these two, this dichotomy that we're drawing. Whether Catholic or not, we know far too little about the relation between lived religion and environmental ideas and practices. Most work has been done on well-known figures, but what I'm going to do tonight is to turn over rocks, and that's what historians do. And you will find profound and pioneering Catholic environmental concern, plentiful but forgotten beneath. So the tradition doesn't have to be invented, it only has to be uncovered. Now, and it's not surprising that it's down there. Questions of cosmic moral order are universal. They are not products of recent eras of environmental crisis, nor dependent on the maturation of the environmental sciences. Always there will be questions of how things are supposed to be and what is my obligation to interact with the cosmos to make them so. So, and if we had time, I would turn over lots of rocks, but some are easy to turn over yourself. So I'm going to turn over three. The first one is one of my favorites, which is the hexameral, the 9 hexameral homilies of the 4th century Cappadocian Basil the Great. Now, of course, this homilist wants to find moral analogies in nature. But Basil, exceptionally well versed in the natural history of Aristotle and Pliny, is fascinated by variety, by order, and recognizes ecological laws. For example, that preyed upon species have high fecundity. He writes of the control of fish populations, of distinct habitats of different fishes, migratory fish, the formation of corals, the morality of sentinel animals like cranes, a matter which Darwin would be fascinated with, parenting among crows, the instincts of vultures, insect metamorphosis as a model for the resurrection, and highlighted natural virtues like the urge to health and the care of offspring. Now, Basil's hearers must have had this natural knowledge to appreciate his morals. But the ecological phenomenon to which he draws attention stand on their own, too. He is very interested in self-acting natural systems. Well, Basil was rare as far as we know, but how rare? And that's a hard question to answer. But you can read his homilies easily. They're available online, especially the 7th through the 9th, I suggest. Okay. Rock 2. Asking the question, what did Catholic German youths in the beginning of the 19th century learn about God, nature, and appropriate human aspirations and behaviors? Here's the 1803 Catholic edition of Reflections on the Works of God and His Providence Throughout All Nature for Each Day of the Year. Author of this best-selling and now completely unknown devotional almanac was the Orthodox Lutheran pastor Christoph Christian Sturm, who lived from 1740 to 1786. It appeared in innumerable translations and adaptations across the range of Christian denominations for more than 50 years. Now, broadly, the genre of Sturm's work is natural theology, not in the theologian sense of all non-scriptural theology, including logic and metaphysics, but in the narrower sense of design arguments, features of the world that establish the existence and character of God, and purposes we can construe for natural things as indicative of God's intentions. Usually, the enterprise, prominent from 1650 to 1850, is seen as Protestant and Anglican in particular. In England, it is apologetic and political, an attempt to show that God wants things as they are. But exploration of French and German natural theology, barely begun, makes clear that it is not uniquely Protestant, nor usually political. German natural theology, perhaps 1,000 titles from the 1710s through the 1750s, is doxological, essential, or existential, and pastoral. It treats nature as the medium of our earthly dealings with God. Effectively, these works are expansions of various psalms and on the end of the book of Job, where God answers Job's laments with a series of rhetorical questions which may amount to divine endorsement of biodiversity. Sturm's almanac digests this large literature. Overall, his theme is humility. In every season are reminders of death, also exhortations to charity, patience, and acceptance. Aspects of nature have both systemic and symbolic importance. A common subject is brontotheology. You know what brontotheology is? You should from today. The theology of thunderstorms, okay, which we're having right now. Brontosauruses are thunder dinosaurs. Thunderstorms, Sturm says, stir the air, purifying it of noxious exhalations and increase fertility, which in fact they do. But they also exhibit God's grandeur. Sturm is also thankful for what fills human needs: sheep, horses, silkworms, the grape whose fermentation can relieve misery and solace affliction. But a century before ecology, he sees each species as having a certain purpose Everything is connected, he declares. No creature is useless or placed there without an end, though we are ignorant of the ends of what he estimates as 400,000 animal species. Does anyone think that no rapacious animals should exist upon the earth, he asks. Let such people reflect that by the beast of prey, the number of animals which would be troublesome to us is diminished. Anticipating Rachel Carson and opposing eradication of agricultural pests, Sturm argues that God invests in bugs too. Look at their intricacy. Eradication would destroy whatever ecosystem services, our word, his concept, a species provides. We should not interfere with nature's equilibrating processes, even where species appear, quote, only to exist to torment mankind. American colonists, he says, tried to kill jays only to have their crops overwhelmed by worms and caterpillars. Ecological reflections were self-cultivation too. Sturm and his colleagues worried about how we engage practically, emotionally, and ethically. In kindness to nature, we learn charity. In admitting that other parts of the world are significant to God, we learn humility. Indeed, resignation reigns, not only to the will of God, but to the fixed stations in society, which was still pretty much feudal. Sturm and his readers do not face, however, a seriously fragile world in which free persons in many cultures and polities must find ways to reconcile natural systems with human flourishing. As with Basil, we still know very little about what Sturm's readers thought and did. But not so with my third rock, and the one that I'm going to talk about at greatest length. And this is the activities of the National Catholic Rural Life Conference, now known as Catholic Rural Life, in the upper Midwest from the 1930s to the 1940s. This is what John and Reeve and I wrote about a decade ago, and we explored it as an exemplar of a uniquely Catholic form of environmentalism. A few other historians have also explored it: Edward Shapiro, David Bovey, and Peter Marlett. And now Father Michael Woods has written about its role in liturgical renewal. But generally, it remains invisible in Catholic history and environmental history. And if you know about this past, I'll be surprised. I'm sort of assuming that I'm going to be telling you things that you don't know. John and I avoided triumphalist Catholics were there first rhetoric. But in many cases, post-Rachel Carson environmentalism has been a rediscovery of ideals and practices familiar to Midwestern Catholics a quarter of a century earlier. So today I want to recover that history, but also to push a little bit further. The significance, I think, of the conference to American environmental history goes beyond its status as a Catholic organization, and it is not merely a matter solely of the past, but of the present and future. So I'm talking about an American institution at this meeting about world Catholicism, precisely because I think it is exemplary of some of the things that can happen and are happening in many places of the world, I think. So this organization is so important, I think, because its founders thoroughly and thoughtfully explored the necessary integration of three foundations of environmental change: the institutional, the technical, and the personal, or if you prefer, the cultural, spiritual, and existential. Now, since the conference's work is not well known, I shall introduce you to its themes through the work of a fellow traveler who is the Kentucky scholar, poet, and farmer Wendell Berry, who is one focus of my early work with Phil Shepard. For 4 decades, Berry's essays about culture and agriculture have resonated widely, especially, I suspect, in Catholic context. You just try Googling Wendell Berry and Catholic. Most famous was The Body and the Earth, the climactic essay in Berry's best-known 1977 book, The Unsettling of America, though this essay was an expansion of his blunter 1972 Discipline and Hope. Berry, Barry holds that our relationship to the earth cannot be other than our relationship to ourselves. He was challenging an immature individualism, an illusion of some enlightened elect few that they could jettison society for purifying wilderness. In fact, the Baptist Barry was rejecting the Thoreau, John Muir Protestant heritage of American environmentalism for one which, though he appears not to know it, was far better developed in American Catholicism. A literary scholar, Barry helps us dissect human words, and so consider four: settle, proper, husband, and fertile. Settle. Those who assumed the unsettling of America would be simply concerned with demographic change, family, farm, and corporate agriculture, discovered that settle meant to feel oneself whole in one's place. Proper was linked to propriety, appropriate, and property. Barry's Jeffersonian agrarianism meshed with distributism developed by the English Catholics Chesterton and Belloc following Pope Leo's 1891 Rerum Novarum, and amidst a welter of what Peter Gould calls green socialist alternatives to capitalism and Marxism. Private property was vital, but in family-sized units. For God's land must serve godly ends of nurturing persons through nurturing families. But the family was not simply a reproductive unit, it was the foundational unit of society. Husband. Dwelling on the link between husband and husbandry as the art of agriculture, Barry made clear that the family was also the foundational unit of sustainability. The husbandman was bonded to the hus as well as to the huswife. The terms reflected the law of entail. A hus, distinct from a cottage, was, with its estate, a permanent structure, a renewable family-producing research over which its tenants had a life interest and over which they must exercise stewardship. Fertility. We preside over life. The fertility we talk of when we empty bag into spreader and the fertility of human reproduction are not profoundly different, Barry insists. Neither is merely a matter of chemicals, both are matters of responsible personhood. Material order cannot coexist with spiritual disorder, he writes. It is impossible to care for each more or differently than we care for the earth. But a generation earlier, 3 Midwestern bishops, articulating what they were calling the Catholic rural philosophy, had written, human erosion is closely related to soil erosion. Barry is eloquent, but like the Vanderbilt agrarians and others, he is also nostalgic. His yearning for a vital culture of settlement and faithful stewardship magnifies its absence. And issues of reflexivity arise. Barry forces a choice on us. We can be the happy peasant or the pastoral poet and reader of poetry who reflects on the life of the peasant. His ignorance of Catholic agrarianism and Catholics' ignorance of it are tragedies, for the agrarians of the 30s and 40s insisted that we could and must be both. For they lived what Barry teaches. Evidence comes from Sonia Solomon's 1992 book, Prairie Patrimony, studying 7 generations of land transfers in central Illinois. Solomon distinguished between a Yankee approach of Scottish-Irish Protestants in which farming was a business and land a commodity, and a German approach in which farming was a way of life and land a sacred family possession. In terms of sustainable stewardship, the latter, settling, not speculating, was more successful. Many of these Germans were Catholics, immigrating as communities. They brought the communal patterns of peasant societies. Though ostensibly national, the National Catholic Rural Life Conference, founded in 1923, thrived in the so-called German Belt, Missouri to Minnesota, Illinois to Kansas. Already, Catholic communal self-help organizations, united as the St. Louis-based Central Verina, paved the way. Now, I cannot, in a short time, do justice to the richness of this organization's work, nor do the several historians with several fine histories fully do that. We need a lot more work on this subject. The conference was founded as an offshoot of the National Catholic Welfare Conference by Father Edwin O'Hara, an Oregon priest concerned with the viability of rural Catholicism. Outside heavily Catholic areas, some systematically colonized by ethnic groups, it was hard to maintain religious identity in majority Protestant communities. The answer, he recognized, went beyond churches and priests. It required addressing all aspects of communities, including economic, educational, social, and even medical services. The conference's mission would also include meeting the needs of the rural poor, including farm workers, resettlement of urban Catholics, and spiritual enhancement of rural life. Such matters were made pressing by the Great Depression. How should the church respond to secular farm organizations concerned mostly with prices, to complex New Deal policies, to urban despair and farm bankruptcies, but also to the extremism of far right and far left? That would lead in 1933 to the articulation of the Catholic Green Revolution. It referred not to high-yield crops as it does now, but to a Catholic alternative to the communist thread and the fascist black or brown. Now, roughly speaking, the 1930s were occupied with the working out of a Catholic world philosophy, the 1940s with its implementation. The philosophy had three legs: the institutional, the technical, and the personal, spiritual, or cultural. Together, these constituted what Byrne would call solutions of pattern. Each must undergird the others in many ways and at many levels. Technologies, later called alternative and appropriate, must mesh with institutions, but also enhance the flourishing of the human spirit, which in turn feeds back into practices and institutions. Now, it's worth reflecting on the enormity of that project. Almost always, scholars who engage with environmental issues are experts in some domain, science and technology, or policy, or ethics. Working out ideal solutions within their domains, they expect others to accommodate. But often that doesn't happen. Values, or the translation of scientific truths, just doesn't mesh with institutions or the built environment in which we live. But here, and this was crucial, the leaders, lay and clergy, were not specialists, but rather talented and thoughtful generalists, willing to borrow ideas, experiment, and well linked to the hierarchy through the rural life directors established in the 1920s in each rural diocese. The Catholic world philosophy was complete at the end of the decade. It's published in a manifesto on the left here, under the names of three Midwestern bishops, and a companion, Rural Roads to Society, in 1940 by the conference's new executive director, the voluble and indefatigable Monsignor Luigi Leguti, and the Jesuit John Rawl, its most militant prophet. Their work combines a pre-Byrne critique of the unsettlement with a review of Catholic social experiments in alternative institutions, the most important being the homestead community in Granger, Iowa, that Leguti had launched in 1935. Of the three legs of Catholic rural philosophy, the broadest was reform of economic institutions. A great threat to rural families was the monopoly with regard to consumption. Dispersed populations meant little competition in suppliers. With regard to production, the union of mechanization and monoculture crops concentrated landholding, forcing farmers to leave or become tenants, a situation which did not conduce to stability or stewardship. Their answer was cooperatives for purchasing staples, marketing farm products, even possibly owning tools of production. Credit unions were important too. These institutions must be local and embody democratic Rochdale principles. Voting power was by member, not by size and investment. If the tradition of communal self-help came from the German Catholics of the Central Bhine, the more immediate model was the Catholic-led, I wanted to show you that this is Leguti and Father Raw. And you see Leguti's broadcasting, very important for this organization, radio broadcasts. The more immediate model was the Catholic-led regional transformation of the Canadian Maritimes. Fishing and lumbering supported the Scottish Catholic families that had settled around Antigonish in the mid-18th century. But post-World War, mechanization and monopolization was threatening family integrity. Cooperatives and credit unions were the answer. The means to them, capacity building through adult education orchestrated through the Extension Department of the Catholic St. Francis Xavier University, a scheme initiated by the radical Father Jimmy Tompkins and his cousin, the consummate organizer, Father Moses Cody. Its influence on the U.S. cooperative movement, Catholic and secular, was enormous. Consider titles. On the one hand, The Lord Helps Those, How the People of Nova Scotia Are Solving Their Problems Through Cooperation, by Bertram Fowler, published by the leftist Vanguard Press in 1938, and Nova Scotia, The Land of Cooperation, by the Notre Dame sociologist Father Leo Ward, published in 1942 by the Catholic publisher Stephen Ward. The Cody Institute would become a center for Catholic missionary work in economic development and remains a center for microfinance. A Tompkins Institute at Cape Breton University is concerned with appropriate technologies for community building. Now, these were radical reforms and sometimes controversial. To those who saw co-ops as un-American, conference leaders would insist that co-ops were not collectives. In To Save the Farm, a story in the 1946 Faith and Freedom Reader for Catholic school 8th graders, teenage boys, having heard from their parents how hard it is to compete with corporate agriculture, start a co-op with the aid of Father Van Hooyven, who is from Belgium and knows about such things. Expect opposition, he tells them. Father Van Hooyven hopes to enlist Protestant, sympathetic Protestant clergy. In the cases of Legudi and the Canadians, Catholic leadership extended to others in rural communities. Institutional interests were not faith-specific. The involvement of the youth is also intriguing. Their elders may be apathetic, Van Hooyven warns the boys. Inspired by French and Belgian rural Catholic youth movements, chiefly the Jeunesse Agriculturelle Chrétienne, or the Jacquistes, American youths, mainly boys, were beginning cells to spur reform. Members would recruit others, propagating new cells in classic anarchist fashion. Their activism was liturgical too. Quote, our pulpits in the rural areas must interpret the life of the farm in terms of the life of Christ, unquote, asserted a bishop in 1946. The leader of the second leg, communal liturgical renewal, was the Benedictine Virgil Michel of St. John's Collegeville, a chief subject of Father Wood's wonderful book. Michel worried that communion had become individualistic, insufficiently communal. The mystical body of Christ must be recognized not only in churches, but in credit unions, for example, and in many other settings, like those tying the seasons of the church to the seasons of the land. Much was made of St. Isidore, whose fields were plowed by angels while he concentrated on devotions. Included were blessings of fields and flocks and even machinery, and the rogation processions, circumambulating the bounds of the parish, thus celebrating the place of one's life. I'm sorry that is a little bit dark, but you can see in the photograph, they are having a mass on somebody's back porch, and this is the procession that has made its way around the parish. Borrowing from the emerging Scandinavian tradition of folk high schools, there was much attention to the preservation of rural Catholic and even pre-Catholic folkways. At the vast outdoor masses, at conferences, conventions, youths would present the priest with homegrown wheat and grapes for conversion to wine and host. Altar linens and candles were also homemade. So again, huge. This is a youth mass at one of these conventions, and they are again bringing. You can't really see it, but this is where these kids from these rural parishes would bring in the material from the post. Beyond these was the cultivation of the spirituality of rural domestic life, music, poetry, dramatics, artisanship, folk dance, of the celebration of family and communal work, of the meditation that came through in nature. Father Joseph Edel, whose Diary of a Country Pastor began in 1938, writes, for example, of the closeness to God that a Minnesota winter's night brings. Iowa farmer and cell member writes, quote, out on the farm things are real. Life is real. Living is real. Horses, cows, soil, neighbors are real. Everything a man sees and hears and feels is real. Things are there as God put them there. There man cares for what God has made, but never does he shape it into something grotesque and unnatural. There are truth and beauty and goodness, but there is no mirage or imitation. Espousing a Christian philosophy of the land, the bishop notes a la Berry, of the most intimate relation of the body and earth, the land fashions, sustains, and ultimately assimilates the body, assailing the scientism that mistakes that relationship as a matter of chemistry and industry. He insists on a moral and religious engagement. Quote, of what good to know the secrets of the soil, to have control of the productive powers of the land, if man has no control of himself. He goes on, the greatest and most destructive error of our time is the belief that science, mechanics, and legislation are the saving factors. It is this blind faith, the belief that knowledge alone saves, that has brought crisis. The church must teach that man is steward, not owner, and impress the noble conception of the sacredness of the soil, responsibility to God for its right use. Show him how advantageously he can work out his own salvation and that of his family on the land. All this decades before Berry, Rachel Carson, and White. Especially as agriculture lurched toward megafarm and monoculture, a distinct philosophy seemed to require supporting science and technology. To find Catholics concerned with liturgy and communal institutions is hardly surprising, but compost, earthworms, and tractors? There was need for a Catholic agricultural science, just as for Catholic agricultural economics. The Catholic family farm must be a mixed farm, since its object was both family subsistence and modest cash income. It would have plentiful labor, family members, and would nurture remarkable but irreducible skill and value needed for stewardship of the land in perpetuity. Hence, as Berry and others have argued, book learning and algorithms of efficiency were less important than, and even antithetical to, local wisdom and careful use of tools. If American farmers were skeptical of cow college learning, Catholic farmers were doubly so. For them, farming would be mainly about living, not making a living. It did not follow that Catholic farmers actually had the needed tools and know-how. The conference was a clearinghouse for efforts of Catholic colleges to teach and research Catholic agriculture. At Creighton, St. Mary's Abbey Seminary in Kansas, St. John's Collegeville, St. Bede's Abbey in Peru, Illinois, Trinity in Sioux City, St. Benedict's, St. Ambrose's in Davenport, St. Emma's in Virginia. Here too were borrowings, mainly from the German-Swiss biodynamic agriculture, chief source of what the Rodales would popularize as organic agriculture. Catholics understood biodynamic both broadly, techniques that facilitated social and spiritual as well as biological sustainability, and narrowly, the precise composting processes Ehrenfried Pfeiffer had developed from the mystical teachings of Rudolf Steiner. Similarly central was soil conservation. Under the Soil Conservation Service, communities fostered best practices. In some places, this achievement relied on the social capital of the parish. In Missouri, Monsignor Alfalfa George Hilder, the mystical body of Christ was on the farm too. Farms might not be the cleanest of places, but they were sites of human production and should not be disorganized or dirty. Barn paint was a priest's business. I'm not going to talk more about this, but one of the issues that comes up a good deal is about the fact that living on the land and living with the land gets you dirty. And there's concern about Catholics wanting to be bourgeois and wanting to be too clean. So this is a concern about what happens to Catholics who go off to college, that they forget their roots in the land. On to implementation. Too much, we humanist academics focus on ideas. Practices are harder to follow. The conference has been criticized as being a priest's movement. In the 30s, it was. a farmer's paper, The Christian Farmer, failed within 3 years of its 1948 launch. But its impact went beyond memberships and subscriptions. We should include the radio broadcasts, weekly press releases, and participation in its events, schools, retreats, and annual conventions. Having articulated a Catholic rural philosophy, the conference's first task was to promulgate it to rural and mostly young priests. It did this through summer schools. The first was at St. John's in 1940. By the mid-1940s, there were schools in the Northeast, the High Plains, Deep South, and the Southwest, each adapted to the regional, social, and technical issues. 55 and 60 schools in 1944 and 1945, teaching thousands of priests, teaching sisters, lay leaders, and seminarians about co-op formation, leadership skills, catechistics, and sustainable science. St. John's in 1940, Father Henry Retzek, who was a priest and a geologist from West Union, Minnesota, taught on the nature and proper treatment of the soil, and on climate and climate variations and their relation to the soil. And there was an intensive workshop on biodynamic farming, and they had a couple of priests who were basically doing agronomy there. Sympathetic Minnesota Extension and USDA representatives taught too. Priests learned how to keep hogs worm-free. 3 years later, at a meeting of school directors on best curricular practices, there was consideration of how much science and technology to teach. The answer, general coverage of crops best suited to the area, crop rotation, and soil conservation and fertilization. But they thought that the real foundation of sustainable agriculture should be in seminary training. There, building on general courses in chemistry and biology, future priests could study up on questions of scientific agriculture. Well, is sustainable agriculture now taught in seminaries? As far as I know, it's not, but I'd be interested to learn if it was. Maybe it should. By 1945, summer schools led to retreats for Catholic farm family members to develop a, quote, deep supernatural life, unquote, to comprehend their lives and work in terms of Christian ethics and recognize their duties as stewards on the land. One of the first in Winona drew 800. A later broadside to Montana farmers and ranchers listed the goals of such two-day retreats. To understand the meaning of life, just work and get ahead, or is life really joyous and worthwhile? To appreciate the dignity of the farmer and the factors that degrade or dignify life. To hear scriptural views on farming. To improve farm living so descendants will want to continue to homestead. And finally, to acknowledge the great responsibilities rural people have, the account they will give to God in caring for the land, the animals, and the machinery entrusted to them. The retreats were not just for Catholics, but for all of goodwill, not afraid to work and pray. And note the bottom, the retreats would be very good for professional men and women, exceptional for business people. Sorry, again, I think you probably can't. I tried to blow this up, but I think it doesn't come out clearly. That final phrase suggests that just as green business has become a nucleus of contemporary environmental change, the conference also translated social capital into commerce. We know also that at least some retreats included basic instruction, and again, this is a document which is kind of amazing. I've got a few quotations from it, so you can just look at this as I go on. Instruction in these retreats on sustainable technology and considerations about the ethical treatment of animals. These are not just occasions for prayer and meditation. Finally, the movement may be measured by attendance at the conference's annual week-long October conventions. 15,000 in St. Cloud, Minnesota in 1940. 30,000 in Columbus in 1949. An essay contest on rural life elicited 3,800 submissions in the Columbus Diocese. A pageant at that convention titled The Golden Secret of Green Acres had a cast of 1,200 and an audience of 5,000. And was an opportunity to market those wonder worms which I showed you a few slides ago, which were for conversion of animal and vegetable waste into compost, nature's own brand of rich fertilizer. Now, the conference's orientation shifted during the 1950s. The social and political environment had changed. Championing co-ops was too red in the co-op. A generation of new chemical inputs, pesticides and fertilizers, and economies of scale made it harder for the mixed family farm to compete, nor was there yet a large market for organic or artisanal foods. Large-scale production acquired moral priority too. Fighting international communism, and more immediately for Catholics, demonstrating that the world was not overpopulated, mandated producing food cheaply for a hungry world, and paying less attention to social, cultural, and environmental costs. As inflation made it harder to rely on farm income alone, whoops, I'm not my slides. So this is a parade at the St. Cloud Convention. This is a parade of Catholic rural youth down the main streets. So this is what I want to do. The conference turned to what it called two-footed living. Taking advantage of the automobile and the new parkways, Dad might work in the city, but the suburban home should remain a mini farm. Now, when I arrived at Notre Dame in 1985, vestiges of this approach still survive as the family project, where a few faculty members nurtured the ideals of the 40s. But for most upwardly mobile Catholic families, the dirty dependency of farm life was to be renounced. Lawn replaced garden, just as golf course replaced farm at Notre Dame. Now, once the environmental movement had begun in the 1970s, the conference would reacquire a green focus, though by that time its past had been largely forgotten. Its chief periodical, known earlier as Landward and Land and Home, would be called Earth Matters for a time. Quite properly, it would not understand itself as primarily an environmental organization. That would have missed the point. History is easy to lose. Past with no immediate use do get discarded, covered with rocks. But we can recover the resource, not only for particular practices, but for identity. We know who we are partly by understanding where our heritage has been. For many reasons, I think it is time for many to turn over this particular rock. In the post-natural world in which we live, redemption through the wild is unavailable, even if it were desirable. A Catholic, or if you prefer, Byrne sustainability, avoiding false dichotomies of natural versus human, seems suddenly both more plausible and more appealing. I focused on Catholic agrarianism not because I urge a massive shift to the countryside. In many places that would be neither viable nor desirable, but instead I admire these pioneers for the recognition of the need for integration. Theology, policy, science as tools to a personhood, which includes a sense of permanent planetary settlement. Now, many are now concerned with integration in food, institutions, and spiritual life, but we try to do so in disintegrated societies. Homes are sites for producing persons, but less often of the material, social, institutional parts of our lives. That would have seemed odd and unnatural to these Catholic agrarians. There is, of course, nowadays interest in rooftop gardening and microfinance, yet little, it seems to me anyway, of an integrating vision of human identity which would bring these things all together. So that's the reason for my fascination with these green revolutionaries, which is renewed every time I go back to them. And even though I wrote the article in, about a decade ago, I went up to Marquette to look at the archives again a few weeks ago. And every time I get a new sort of boost of inspiration. I'm amazed by their acuity. I'm exalted by their prose, poetry, visual art, and liturgy. And this illustration from the Catholic edition of Sturm's book, which you saw earlier on the title page, is of a kind that's very frequent in these German natural theologists of the 18th century. But these two on either side come from the early 1940s in the National Catholic Rural Life movement, an artist named Sister Irina, and they are really about the same sort of thing. The one on the right I think is spectacular. I would love to have a huge blow-up of that on my wall. I think it's just one of the most powerful pieces of art I've ever seen. Anyway, so I love their art, their prose. I haven't talked very much about their prose, but their poetry, the essays of people like Father Edel are just amazing pieces of nature writing that, again, we just don't know about. And then also just staggered by their work and achievement. Running 55 summer schools is a lot of work, and particularly one person, Father Mark Scherber, took on the organization, the coordination of people who went around the country to teach at these successive schools. So it's an enormous kind of commitment. This is really a social movement we're talking about. And then I'm appalled by the utter invisibility of this achievement today. So that's why I wanted to talk to you about it. So, but I don't just want to talk to you about it. I want you to sort of discover it on your own. The periodicals are available in libraries. This kind of stuff is mentioned in other Catholic periodicals of the period. The archives of this institution are up at Marquette, and so this is accessible. But I think it would be really valuable if people in Catholic universities made a kind of concerted attempt to sort of recover this heritage. And I'm sure it exists not just in America. So a lot of this is borrowed from European Catholicism. I think probably what I have said will resonate with things that are going on and have gone on in other parts of the world that we just have to recover and reuse. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
We do have time for questions, but I would ask you, if you do have a question, please come to the mic in the middle. We are recording the program this evening, and it's very important that your question be heard and that it get recorded as well. So if you have any questions, and if you have comments or stories to share, if you would, just stay afterwards. Chris will be here and share those, but let's limit it now to any questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you very much, Chris, for a wonderful, very fascinating lecture on the history of this Catholic movement in America. The cover is quite fascinating, especially the movement and how powerful and strong, and the impact of that I thought was very, very, very strong. I'm still surprised, even though you mentioned these factors that might have led to decline, I'm still surprised that we have completely forgotten all that history. And I would appreciate if you can say a little more about the factors of that complete forgetfulness, and how completely you don't even find any trace that integration between ecology and theology and man. Even in the Midwestern section of the United States, we are alive, the growing of food. I'm still fascinated, and I would love to hear more of the reasons why this seems like almost a kind of unthinkable past.
I wish I knew the answer to that question. So I have little bits of maybe answers to that question. I think a number of things are issues. One, I think, is that American Catholics really have understood themselves as early, and most of them were early. So One part of agrarian Catholicism, which I didn't mention, is the Catholic Worker Farms. So about the same time as this was going on, the Catholic worker movement was getting going. And one of their operations was to move people out of the cities, and they had some farmsteads in various places. And that is reasonably well known. And it's very much part of the sort of central story of the Catholic worker movement in the history of American Catholicism. That organization and this organization were really, they had some overlap, but they were differently oriented. So one of the concerns about of the organization I've been talking about the Catholic worker movement was many of the people who were urban really didn't want to live on farms. I mean, they didn't see themselves as farmers. They were living on farms because it was the Depression, and they needed to live. So this other organization, though, was really much more oriented toward people who were already living on farms. So I think that's one aspect of it. I think the issues that I mentioned of the Cold War, the Cold War really does change American history so profoundly in terms of what happens to social experiments. And social experiments which in the 1930s you can think very seriously about can't be thought about in the 1930s. And I think the church, if you look at the periodicals of this organization, you see a very clear change after about 1952, where they're no longer interested in sort of social and economic issues. They're mostly simply interested in sort of the core religious issues, liturgical issues, and things like that. And it's quite a sharp change. So there's that, and then finally, I think there's the demographic aspect of it, is that as it became increasingly hard to run a small mixed farm in the Midwest, there are fewer and fewer people. So already, the church was trying to sort of figure out how are we going to deal with dispersed populations. I mean, how many people do you have to make a parish viable, and that kind of thing. And so, as that population dwindles, then it becomes those priests go elsewhere, and so it becomes, it gets forgotten in that way. Part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this is I do have this hope that, if I go around and talk about this, there will be people who will have memories of this, because all these people who attended these retreats and attended these schools, some of them are probably still alive, but they're probably pretty elderly. My father actually, when I started to work on this, he said, "Oh yes, I remember Lagudi." He remembered when Lagudi came around. I said, "Lagudi was a great guy. He was amazing." And I had no idea that my father had, didn't do anything about Lagudi. But, there were still people, and maybe still are people around who remember this, but I think, again, unless our historians help us consolidate this past, and say, we want to make this public, it's important to be part of this, it's not going to get done. Thanks for your question.
Thanks very much for a great talk. This is sort of related, but I was very struck by that imagery a couple slides ago, the 1 foot in each land. And you said that was sort of one of the, what we call the dying gas tour thing. Could you follow up on that? I mean, did that resonate at all, and did that come to anything?
It's one of the things that I find most ironic, because even in 1940, when Raw and Lagudi write their book, they do think that the automobile is going to be very important in sort of strengthening the rural parish. And they really are, at least some of the people who are writing about this really are northeastern bishops. So they're thinking about the new parkways around New York are getting built, this kind of thing. And so, and a lot of the interest in sort of communal living is coming out of the New York area. I think called forgotten the exact name. There are secular groups that are interested in the same kinds of agrarianism. So they're very interested in that. And you know, the assumption is because these will be families coming from rural areas, of course they will want to continue sustainable farming when they move into the suburb. They think that there is coming after the Second World War technologies that will facilitate sort of intensive agriculture on your suburban piece of land. But they're not taking into account cultural change. And you know, I put this quip up here about farms changing into golf courses. Notre Dame had a Department of Agriculture in the 20s and 30s. You could major in agriculture. They had a big farm, and you know, in 1932, precisely at the time when the Catholic rural life movement was getting going, they shut that down and turned that land into golf courses. You know, and the notion was that you know, if you're upwardly mobile, this is the kind of skill that you have. So I think that you know, again, a lot of what Catholic universities were about is upward mobility. And so that, you know, if all your other suburban neighbors were celebrating the fact that you didn't have to get your hands dirty, right, then, you know, you probably want to do that too. And so, you know, I find this ironic because we have all this suburban land and there's room there for people to grow things, but, you know, that's not what people do. So it was, you know, it was kind of one of the few instances where their conception of a social vision of American sociology and American culture just was completely wrong. But you know, they really did take this quite seriously.
Thanks, Chris. That was really fascinating. My question is, what's going on with that? I know that the National Rural Life Conference still exists, with a slightly different name, I think.
Yeah, it's called Catholic Rural Life.
Catholic Rural Life. What are they doing? I mean, it seems like the moment is perfect for them for there to be a kind of resurgence with the Pope's encyclical and so on. The bishops seem more interested in, you know, lobbying Congress rather than pouring effort into this, but it seems like the moment is right. Can you talk about what's going on with it right now?
I mean, I've been sort of in touch with this organization, you know, about 3 decades, and it, you know, it's a kind of organization, like many organizations, that is always underfunded, and so they're always struggling. They're always trying to find a mission and a mission, this kind of thing. When I first came to Notre Dame, Father Monsignor Joseph Vermillion, who had been its leader for a while, was on the faculty, and so I talked to him about it. And he was sort of one of the last of the sort of the Moody types who was really interested in sort of the social and economic side of things. Later on, I got to know Brother David Andrews a little bit, and you know, I think as a sort of struggling organization, one of the things that happens is that the leadership changes a lot. And so, you know, if you have an office that's run by about 4 or 5 people, and that leadership, you know, just turns over fairly quickly, there's not this kind of institutional memory. So when I knew I was coming here to give this talk, I emailed them. I said, hey, I'm going to come here to DePaul and give this talk about the organization. And I did get an email back from the person who was in charge of publicity, but just one email. He never sort of responded again. So and I don't really know. I mean, is the honest answer. They are, you know, the publications, they are very interested in environmental issues. So they remain interested if we committed to these kinds of issues. But I think that, you know, again, it's hard to sustain the continuity when leadership rotates. You're out fundraising all the time and trying to keep it.
So they don't get any funding from the bishops or anything?
No, this was always an independent organization.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yeah, it was that's an interesting story there about why that is. I never quite understood. I think there's a hidden story which I don't have access to.
You had pictures of the large numbers of people gathered for the outdoor celebrations. How was that communicated to the people? Was it communicated through the newspapers, through the priests at Mass? So I mean, I was wondering what the means of communication was. When I grew up in a town of 400 Ozark Hills, we would do planned progress, and it was just kind of word of mouth that everybody would go up one farmer plant and we'd plow, and we worked it that way by word of mouth, just among the small group of farmers. So I was wondering how that was.
So this is one of the many $24 questions, which when I ended up saying, I want everybody to go out and do research on this, well, that's one of the questions. And so my answer is, I'm going to speculate. I think one of the things that there are Catholic newspapers in many of these areas. And if you look at, now the archive up at Marquette has clipping files of this organization, and many of these come from Catholic newspapers. So the conference sent out a press release every week on some issue or another. And these are getting picked up in the Catholic newspapers. I don't know if they're also getting picked up in non-Catholic newspapers. That would be interesting. Okay. They also are doing radio broadcasts on, and of course those are not exclusively Catholic radio stations, which is amazing in our weekly radio broadcasts. In terms of looking at the kind of Catholic newspaper coverage you're getting of these, it's enormous. So in the Columbus paper, for example, you're getting, for weeks before this convention takes place, there's articles about who's coming, what the different activities are. Lots of activities. So they're taking over these sort of Midwestern, modest-sized Midwestern cities for a week at a time, and with lots of things going on. Those are some means of communication. Now, the other thing that I've got to think is that the whole point of having these summer schools for priests is that, and also for teaching sisters, and also for lay leaders, is that, they're creating this network of people who will then go out and sort of, yes, this will be in issues. Looking at the periodicals for this period, there is a lot about people who are not sort of the leaders of the organization writing in and talking about the salvation issues. So it's really just, you do get a sense that people are reading this. Some of the other kinds of ways they're doing this, there are women's organizations like the Grail. So these are fairly active. 4-H is fairly active in this in some places. So, a lot of community organizations. It would be interesting to know, as with the Montana flyers, how much this gets to be a community thing that's not sort of just only Catholic. But it seems in some places it clearly does.
You're going from 1934. Are you planning to do anything going backwards? Because you did allude to some of the ethnic, and of course Father Ligeti is obviously not Irish. Are you planning to do anything about the groups before that, especially?
Well, I think, I'm not immediately, but I mean, it's a good idea. Okay, so one of the things is that my colleague Phil Gleason did his doctoral dissertation on this German Catholic organization called Central Byrne. And it's a wonderful newspaper, which is called Central Black and Social Justice. And this newspaper was like a weekly, not really a newspaper, it's like a magazine, until about the mid-20s. It's all in German. And then it sort of becomes half in German and half in English. So my German is not good enough to go and spend the kind of time that you'd have to spend in work. It's also, I think, the case that really it's the Depression that, I mean, there are a lot of communal organizations, there's a lot of concern about sort of issues of the viability of parishes and things in rural areas in the earlier period. But it's only with the Depression that there comes this notion of crisis, and that you sort of have to rethink how all these elements go together. And that's when you begin to see there's several conferences where there's sort of the conferences that led up to that manifesto that I showed. And these are conferences where people start using this term Green Revolution, and they start looking at what are the available social philosophies, and where's the one that's going to be genuinely capitalist, what's going to make it bad, and this kind of thing. So that's the period that interests me the most, because it's the period of sort of really exciting, just sort of in terms of social thought, the history of social thought and social organization. That's really amazing. But it's a very good point. So had anyone ever heard of Father John Raw? So, I haven't found anybody yet who has. No, but he's really, I think, in terms of philosophers of this sort of issue, he's the person who is the sharpest. He's somebody who is sort of advertised. He's on the faculty of Creighton for a while, and he's sort of represented. He's a sociologist. He's a philosopher. He's an agronomist altogether, and he's a kind of amazing person.
If there aren't any other questions, let's give Chris another round of applause. Thank you.